Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you feel so inclined throughout the show to want to interact directly with me through leaving some comments, questions, or concerns, or tips or donations, what have you, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, or Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Even our website is a great place to leave a tip or donation if you so choose through gsmcpodcast.net. But any way you decide to interact with the show is greatly appreciated and just makes this show that much better. But without further ado, let us jump into that second segment of the day and let's discuss the waiver wire. We are quickly winding down the fantasy football season here. I know we still have, it seems like a lot of weeks left, but they're quickly shortening by the week and the months and eventually the end of the year. So this waiver wire is definitely going to look a bit crazier than we think, especially considering, how certain fantasy football managers might view their teams at this point, whether or not they're packing it in, whether or not they still think they can make the playoffs, whether or not they're sitting pretty at the top and they just want to bolster their squad. So these are all players who can do that for you in whatever capacity you need. But I do think that there's something to be said about certain waiver wire pickups and their teams and where they are in the season that could affect your decisions on the waiver wire. For example, a lot of these players are on teams that are either in contention or trying to make that playoff push. Some might be considered out of it, as well. But still, it's definitely something to consider when you're looking for players that you want to bolster you. Do you think that they're going to play out the season and not give it their all? Or do you actually think that because their teams are in awkward situations, that they will continue to perform at this standard? So without further ado, let's talk about these players. And let's talk about one that's pretty polarizing. Taysom Hill, and what his importance can mean both for the Saints playoff push and for your fantasy football playoff push. Because he is a very weird, confounding player, especially in a fantasy context. Because I don't necessarily know if this Saints team is really looking towards the playoffs or, if they're simply utilizing Taysom Hill to potentially give this team a little bit more spark. Because it seems like they're in a weird situation, right? They fired Dennis Allen. Darren Rizzi's the interim. Has won 2 games so far. And suddenly, there's hype around the Saints again. But is this hype real, or is it just a factor of this interim head coach bringing this different light to this team? And so where Taysom Hill falls into that equation, I don't know. But when he plays, you always have to think that he's going to be the focal point of what the Saints do. They're going to try to get him as many touches as possible, and they're going to try and factor him into their game plans. Whether or not that equates to their own success on the field doesn't necessarily matter, but from a fantasy context, you can take advantage of what the Saints might be thinking right now. Because either way, whether they're not going to make this playoff push or they are, they're going to want to try and utilize certain weapons to the best of their abilities and see what they have, because they are also one of the teams that has the worst cap situation, so they're going to want to try and figure things out as well to see who sticks around. So Taysom Hill is certainly going to be a figure to monitor, potentially not a pickup right away, but give it a couple weeks, and then maybe once the fantasy playoffs hit and you need someone as a last second addition, then he could be sitting pretty there for you. Then let's talk about 2 guys we also discussed on yesterday's show. Jonnu Smith for the Miami Dolphins and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine for the Tennessee Titans. 2 players in very weird situations. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, of course, on a Titans team that's not expected to make the playoffs anymore. But still, is a very intriguing one in that Will Levis does have that big arm of his, and they did connect for that 98-yard touchdown, and he has played very well. I believe he scored 12 plus fantasy points in all 3 of their past contests. So that's something of note when you're considering these lower tier teams for your waiver wire additions. Because when you think about these guys, you have to think about them in the context of their situation, right? That's paramount when you're looking at the waiver wire. And Nicholas Bukakine is in a situation where the Titans aren't going anywhere, but he has this quarterback who can take advantage of his verticality. And so that's why I think Nicholas Bukakine could be effective, maybe not for your fantasy football playoffs proper, but for that push, right? Say if you're in the middle of the pack and you want to ensure that you make it into the playoffs in these last couple of games, then Nicholas Bukakine could be of more value to you than someone on a contending NFL team. So look for Nicholas Bukakine to be one of those volatile players who is either going to be on rosters late into the fantasy playoffs or kind of on those fantasy rosters that want to make that final push, and then eventually he might have to be dropped. And then Jonnu Smith's one of those guys where he could actually be for real on a team that could be very dangerous down the stretch. The Miami Dolphins are definitely backs to the wall situation-wise, but they are a team that still has the offensive firepower to achieve big things. And Jonnu Smith has certainly been one of the surprising factors in this rise for them. And so, looking at how, he might have to fit in for the rest of the season, a lot of people might be a little bit apprehensive to pick him up, but I think this is no fluke. This is a guy in Jonnu Smith who I truly believe can be a fantasy factor and a real-life factor for the Miami Dolphins. So, these are 2 players, right, in very weird situations. One whose team might want to push for the playoff, one whose team is definitely out of it. But both could be very effective in terms of whatever strategy you want to employ from a fantasy perspective. So that's why I had to include them as well. Then another guy at a running back position on a contending team who has essentially seen his touches kind of skyrocket in the past couple of weeks and might play a lot more for this Minnesota Vikings team as Aaron Jones kind of recovers from his rib injury. Cam Akers could definitely be an interesting play, especially if you're someone who wants to bolster your squad for the fantasy football playoffs in preparation for it. So Cam Akers, while he's certainly not, the most effective in fantasy production, I think that at least his touches will skyrocket and his opportunities will arise in these coming weeks should the Vikings want to rest up Aaron Jones. So that's why I think he as well is very interesting too. And then in terms of other running backs, I feel like, Roschon Johnson's going to be a name that comes up a lot. That's highly dependent on how new OC Thomas Brown views the Bears as a running team. Because when I think about what Thomas Brown might want to do for the Bears moving forward, considering the fact that they technically still are in playoff contention, is just establish a foundation for which Caleb Williams can grow and mature. And we saw in that Packers game was indicative of a Caleb Williams that still has a long way to go, but is willing for change. And we saw mature choices from him in that game, but I still feel like, then again, that running game can really help to bolster this squad as well. Because I like what they can do with DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson and that running back room as a whole. They just have to trust it. And I think that Thomas Brown is going to be smart enough to implement different looks for these running backs to, A, get them better looks and touches, and B, to better help Caleb Williams develop and grow, because you need a strong backfield as a rookie quarterback that you can rely upon in moments like these. So that's why I feel like, even though DeAndre Swift, I feel like, is only going to get better from a fantasy perspective as weeks go on, Roschon Johnson could certainly be someone that can be effective. In terms of the quarterback position, This is where it gets a little bit interesting. We're going to mention some names at the end of the show in my fact versus fiction segment, and they might shock a lot of people. But I want to make a pick now that I feel like is more of a safe ground. How about Anthony Richardson? I know it's kind of wild considering this is a guy who hasn't played many NFL games. This team, this Colts organization hasn't really, seen enough of him to prove that he can lead this team in real life, let alone as a fantasy football manager prove to you all that he can be a solid fantasy player, but he certainly brings a level of hype to this Colts offense, and he brings a reinvigorated energy as well, because while he's definitely erratic, he does present more of a big play threat than a guy like Joe Flacco right now. And it's crazy to say considering what Flacco did with the Browns, but this is a different situation. These Indianapolis Colts feel like they're right in the precipice of being a true playoff contender. And so, while Joe Flacco had that nice run with the Browns, Anthony Richardson, A, needs this in order to develop and mature as an NFL player himself, and B, to actually give some hope and optimism to this Colts squad. And while it sounds funny considering his actions, it still is the best option, in my opinion, for the Colts going forward. Because there's no way that Anthony Richardson sitting on the bench can mean anything to this Colts squad. Even if he loses 11 games or wins 11 games in these next couple of years, this is a guy who I completely think should get an opportunity to prove himself, maybe as a fantasy football manager, to prove himself to you as well. Let me know what you think in the comments about that. Coming up next, we continue my positional rankings with my running backs. I really think that this position's starting to round into another, yet again, very volatile position from a fantasy perspective. So we'll be right back after the break to try and figure this position out.
Looking for your daily